Alright ladies, this screencast is going to cover the fourth and final chapter of Unit 1. And if you have not already done so, please go to Moodle and download the Chapter 4 outline. Just pause this screencast and do that before we move on. So just a few statistics so we can kind of look at an overview of what's happened to the Native American populations since the Europeans arrived in the Americas in the 15th century. In the year 1500, there are 2 million people in North America. That's Native Americans. North America specifically. By 1700, there are only 250,000 Europeans in North America. By 1750, there are only 250,000 Native Americans in North America. So within 50 years, over 250 years, we've gone from 2 million to 255,000 natives. 1700 for Europeans, 250,000. 50 years later, by 1750, there are 1.25 million Europeans and Africans living in North America. So, just another way to look at this, by 1700, there are more Indians than there are Europeans in the Americas, and in North America specifically, but by 1800, that number is flopped. Think about all the things we've discussed in this unit so far as to how this could have come to happen with such a dramatic decrease in Native American populations and such a dramatic increase in European and African populations. So the next thing we're going to talk about is an event called Bacon's Rebellion, which is going to involve Native Americans, kind of in a side context, but it is an important note for this overall unit. So Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion against the colonial government in the Chesapeake. So it's a British rebellion, British colonial rebellion, since it's happening in the Chesapeake region. But this rebellion involves land conflict with Native Americans, and an example of land conflict that existed between Europeans and the natives at this time. So Nathaniel Bacon was an English aristocrat, and he basically challenged the Indian politics of the current Virginia governor at the time, who was William Berkeley. So Bacon's living in Virginia. He doesn't like Berkeley, the governor's Native American politics. Essentially, there were many conflicts with the natives in the Virginia region, conflicts that even Bacon himself had been involved in, fights, attacks on both sides. Governor Berkeley encouraged the militia of Virginia, including Bacon and some of his men he's fighting with in some of these battles, to hold off on blatant Indian attacks, trying to keep the peace. So that's what the governor orders, but Bacon wants to fight against all Indians, and that's actually a very popular opinion by most of the Chesapeake working class individuals, who, remember, early on consist of a lot of indentured servants. A lot of your population in Virginia are middle class men. So they are looking at their, prospects with the land. They would like to fight the Indians. Berkeley is trying to hold them off. Well, Bacon is going to basically call up an army, to fight against Berkeley now and rebel against him. He uses an army of indentured servants as well as slaves. He essentially kind of promised them freedom to any who fought with him. They will actually drive out Governor Berkeley in that event that is known as Bacon's Rebellion. This is the first big rebellion in the British colonies, and this will worry the ruling class moving forward about future rebellions, coming up from the more lower to middle classes and the working classes. And this also just kind of highlights the lengths that some colonists are willing to go to fight natives off of the land. They're willing to spark rebellions over the issue. So that is kind of what I want you to know about the event that is Bacon's Rebellion. Alright, and now we're going to talk about a modern saint, Kateri Tekakwitha. But before we get to her, I want to give a quick side note about Native culture, just since we're going to talk about this woman. Women are far more fully integrated into the civic or political life of the Native American community, just in Native American culture. So women have just a greater overall role in government compared to, very patriarchal European culture at this point in history. And since we're talking about this Native woman, I just wanted to kind of give a note about that, because I think it's kind of something that separates Natives from Europeans at this time, that they would kind of include women more so in everyday civic life. Kateri is an Iroquoian girl, and to be honest, she doesn't really become historically super prominent until after her death. As you know, as I just said, she's recently been named a saint. But she's a good example of something to consider. So as a young girl, she actually overcame smallpox, and she did lose several of her family members to the disease. Her region was eventually occupied by the French, who basically forced the groups to submit and convert to Catholicism. There are Jesuit missionaries in the region. And so she will become baptized as a Catholic, and she does choose to engage in many Catholic practices, such as celibacy, as well as a bit of a more controversial one called self-flagellation. It's essentially when, it's kind of an old Catholic practice, obviously, but it's essentially when people would whip themselves as an act of penance. But she participates in that. And at the time, Jesuit missionaries would look at women like Kateri as women who have really ceased to possess any sort of their, Indian identities. Kind of like she got rid of it all, and that she's fully integrated. But truthfully, in reality, Kateri saw herself as very much both Native American and Catholic. Many of these Catholic rituals and practices, such as celibacy, self-flagellation, there's other ones she participated in, actually have roots and connections, I should say, not roots, but connections or parallels to some Native practices. So to the Europeans, they're not seeing that, but to Natives, they aren't washing away their identity and culture when they choose to change their religion, if they chose to do so. So she's kind of an interesting example of someone who considered herself both Iroquoian and Catholic, even though people maybe didn't see her that way from the outside. And like I said, she recently became a saint. Okay, just to reemphasize a quick idea that Native Americans became increasingly reliant on European goods, and that is part of their eventual disadvantage, because they will start becoming more violent with each other, fighting over access to these goods, rather than the Europeans that they are upset about taking over their land. And that is going to contribute, this violence amongst the actual tribes is going to contribute to the overall decreasing population of the Native Americans in the Americas. So I just want to kind of reemphasize, we talked about that before, but it's a very important concept to think about the transition from just access to European goods to dependence on European goods. Examples are things like horses and guns, and we'll continue talking about those. We're going to look at really quickly the last section here, just a recap and a few new things about Native Americans and the regions that they are existing in North America, and thus kind of affecting their overall experience. And these are general statements, but as a whole, this would be kind of a way to think about what their experience is, depending on where they are settled and where they live. So I want to focus on the Southeast for a second, Southeastern North America, Florida, South Carolina. Native American slavery was very much present in the Southeast, and not just in Spanish Florida. I know we talked about the Spanish enslaving natives for a time, but the Native American slave trade was actually very prominent in South Carolina as well. In South Carolina, they would actually export natives to the Caribbean islands for a profit, as like enslaved labor, free labor. This action would eventually come to an end with a rebellion called the Yamasee War, and this was a uprising. It was actually a multinational uprising, which means various native groups are coming together to fight against the colonial Europeans, and they're rising up against the enslavement, and this will lead to the decline of the Indian slave trade in this region. So this will not be a permanent thing, because we know that African slaves will be used as primary laborers in the southern colonies, but for a while there, it was very prominent in the Southeast, and again, not just in Florida. Now, in the Southwest, recall that Spanish missionaries were present in the Southwest, particularly the Franciscans, and just recall that, their goal was conversion to Catholicism, but they were not very gentle in that process and would often actually choose to use them for forced labor. And so in some cases they were enslaved. So not a good experience in terms of attempted conversion in the Southwest for Native Americans. Now in the Northeast, kind of in your French and British regions, there are also attempts at conversion here, but instead of it being Spanish, it's more of the French Jesuits attempting to convert natives to Catholicism. There were very high death rates in the northeastern tribes, just due to all the European diseases spreading. And there was also some trade happening. Recall that there are trading posts with the British and with the French and Dutch in the Northeast region. Now in the Midwest, there is lots of trade happening. Once again, mainly with the British and the French, thinking about who is occupying kind of that Midwestern region between the Eastern Coast colonies and the Louisiana region a little further west. And as Native Americans began to become more dependent on European goods, they no longer have the advantage over Europeans. The British are able to become more dominant, and natives are less able to play the European powers off of each other when they are dependent on those goods. And in the Midwest, because of all the trade happening, they do become increasingly dependent. And lastly, the Great Plains, a little bit further west of the Mississippi. Trade is also happening here, but specifically horses I wanted to touch on, because the trade in horses are going to dramatically change the nature of Indian societies here. Natives become increasingly dependent on horses for warfare, for hunting, and they intentionally trade them amongst each other in the beginning, but they will eventually raid and war against each other and with each other to get access to them. So their horse dependency is especially strong. All right, y'all. A little long-winded, but overall, y'all have all of Chapter 4, everything you need to know. Please watch this again if you need to, and write down any questions. And on Wednesday, we will review everything, all right? You'll have a good weekend.